So both Adam and Chris touched on the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. And I'm going to be continuing in that book today, but I'm going to look at the book very broadly first, and then zero in on a particular character towards the end of the book. I'm going to see what we'll learn about justice from this story, and then kind of what we learn about God and ourselves too. But I want us to remember as we're going through this series that the Bible is not a terribly straightforward book. It's not like it just reads out as a bunch of rules or how to live or any of that. It's a book to be wrestled with. It's a collection of stories and poems and various other kinds of literature written by different people over long spans of time. So it generally doesn't deliver its content to us nicely wrapped up in a bow the way we might like it to be. The Bible practically begs us to come with our questions and our hopes and our fears. So as we move through this series, I want to encourage us to be honest about those things, to notice our questions, to notice our hopes and fears, and then to move in the direction that the Spirit is calling us into the world of concrete action outside of just ideas and thoughts about it. So in the spirit of being honest, I'm going to tell you that the topic of justice is a really, really hard one for me. It might surprise those of you who might not know me as intimately, but I tend to be kind of pessimistic. And that's been a problem for as long as I can remember. Dave, thank God, is the opposite. We used to joke when we were first dating that when we were first getting to know one another, he introduced me to optimism and I introduced him to reality. And that's kind of cute and funny, but it's actually really kind of sad. And poor guy got the raw end of the deal. But anyway, the point is that when I think of justice, what stands out to me most is injustice. And when I say it stands out to me, what I mean by that is it feels like the world right now is sort of this overwhelming avalanche of injustice that has so much momentum that it's impossible to stop it. So because of that, I really struggle. I have to wrestle with hopelessness. Have any of you ever felt that way? Or I suspect I'm not the only one here, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's normal. Maybe that's what God can work with if we're honest about it. So with that little bit of disclaimer and honesty, let's dig in. Chris noted last week that biblical justice is very much tied to the idea of shalom, which is the world as God intended it to be. And in this framework, working for justice is partnering with God to bring the world back into his good intentions. Chris talked about last week the Garden of Eden and how when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, shalom was broken. This story is in Genesis to kind of help us make sense of the world we find ourselves in, right? I think we can all agree, even if you're not as pessimistic as I am, that the world right now is not the way God intended it to be. It's very much not what he had in mind. The natural world and the relational world, the economic world, any part of the world that you can name is pretty much starving for shalom right now. The first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis kind of go into detail in the way the world descended into brokenness and violence in the wake of our choice to kind of go on our own, in our own way. And it's pretty grim reading, and we're not going to get into much detail there. And then starting in chapter 12, the book zooms in on one family. God chooses Abraham, who's basically kind of a nobody, and promises to give him a family with descendants that are as numerous as the stars in the sky. And he tells them that he's going to bless him so that his family and his descendants can bless the whole world. That was his intention. Now, Abraham lives with this promise into old age with no child of his own, until this promise starts to strike him as laughable. And then when it seems completely impossible, God gives him this child that he promised. And so Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has 12 sons that become eventually the 12 tribes of Israel. And Jacob's second to the youngest son is Joseph. And Joseph is the story that I'm going to really look at today. But as I'm telling this story, I want you internally to notice what are the repetitions in the story. I don't usually tell a big story through like this, but it gives us an opportunity to notice what are the things that are repeated. Where are the gaps in the story? What parts of the story make you curious? And what does this story tell us about justice? There's no story in the Bible that's going to tell us everything we need to know about justice. And most of the stories, frankly, because of the way the Bible is, end up leaving us with more questions. They answer some questions and then they leave us wondering about things. But I want you to be open to that. So just notice those things as I'm telling the story. So Joseph is Jacob's favorite child, the Bible says. And that's because he was born when Joseph was an old man. And Joseph did not keep his favoritism a secret. He was very out loud about it, and he made Joseph this special coat so that everywhere Joseph went, his brothers were reminded that their father loved Joseph more than he loved them. Joseph also seems to have been given a role by his father to go and check up on his brothers now and then, and it says that he brought a bad report back to his father. And when that's kind of the first details that you have about the relationship between these brothers, you kind of can see that it's not going to go well. Then when Joseph was 17 years old, he starts to have dreams. In his first dream, which he shared with his brothers, Joseph and his brothers were tying up these bundles of grain, and suddenly all of their bundles gathered around Joseph's bundle and bowed down to it. And the brothers really did not like this at all. They did not like this dream. And it says that it made them hate him even more. I'm thinking that might have been obvious to Joseph, which is surprising because he had another dream that was even more intense. And he not only told his brothers, he also told his father. And in this second dream, the sun and the moon and the stars all bow down to Joseph. Now, I can't say this strongly enough. No one was digging these dreams. Nobody liked these dreams. His father rebukes him. Then he says he sort of kept it in mind, but he was not liking it. And if you sit back and think about what I've told you so far, you're probably a tiny bit annoyed with Joseph too, right? I mean, here's this kid running around with this special coat, giving bad reports about his brothers, and sharing dreams where he's basically worshipped by his family. So at the very least, he kind of comes off as clueless, and at the worst, he seems like a spoiled brat who has a God complex. But really, all he's doing is telling the truth, right? In an unfiltered way, which, sometimes filters are great, but, but the thing is, he's been given a dream by God. And when you're given a dream by God, I can imagine that that's hard not to share. At any rate, what comes next isn't exactly surprising given this setup, because Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers again. And when they see him from afar, kind of a distance, they decide they're going to murder him, and then they instead sell him into slavery. They kill an animal, they smear the blood all over his nice coat, and they tell his father that he got torn up by an animal and eaten. Now, think about those dreams. Being betrayed by your brothers and sold into slavery does not seem like it's moving in the direction of those dreams becoming a reality, right? So I kind of wonder when I'm reading this, does Joseph think, oh, I must have gotten it wrong? Is there doubt or confusion? If that's a thing that's happening, we are never let in on it in the text. So when he arrives in Egypt, Joseph is purchased as a servant in the home of a man named Potiphar, who's the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. And Potiphar really quickly realizes that Joseph is gifted and trustworthy, and he puts him in charge of his whole house. But it's not long before Potiphar's wife becomes attracted to him, makes these advances towards Joseph. Joseph says, no, I can't sin this way. Potiphar's put me in charge of this whole house. She keeps moving in that direction, and when he completely refuses her, she makes up a story that he tried to sleep with her and Potiphar was in prison. Again, not the direction that you would expect a story to go about a guy who's going to have authority and be respected by his family at the very least. When he gets to prison, again, the guards recognize his gifts, his talents, put him in charge of the whole prison. And this is where some more dreams come in. There's two men in the prison who had positions of authority with Pharaoh, who'd been thrown into prison. They upset Pharaoh for some reason, and they both had dreams that were troubling to them. They didn't know what they meant. And Joseph interprets their dreams. He says in 3 days, the one is going to be restored to his position, and in 3 days, the other one is going to be killed. And he asks the person who's going to be restored, please remember me to Pharaoh. I'm here unjustly, and I just want you to let him know that. The man is released in 3 days, just as Joseph predicted. The other man is killed, but the man who's released promptly forgets about Joseph. I mean, think about this. This is happening over a span of years and years. And after 2 years, the Bible actually says, I'll quote, after 2 whole years, this is going on and on, Pharaoh has 2 dreams that are weird. The 2 dreams are about these 7 scrawny cows eating up 7 fat cows. And then the second dream is 7 thin ears of corn that are diseased, eating up these fat ears of corn. Pharaoh wakes up, he's very disturbed and distressed, doesn't know what they mean, calls all of his court magicians, asks them to interpret his dream. Nobody can do it. And then this guy who was released from prison as a result of Joseph's interpretation says, oh, whoa, I just remembered, totally forgot. I know somebody who can help you interpret your dreams. So they bring Joseph to him. Joseph interprets the dreams and tells him, hey, this means that there's 7 years of good crops and prosperity coming. And that's going to be followed by 7 terrible, terrible years of famine. And so what I think you should do is find a really good, trustworthy man, I'm sure he didn't have himself in mind, to go around the country and collect a portion of everyone's grain when it's prosperous. And then when the famine hits, we will have stores and we can survive. Pharaoh thinks this is a great idea, appoints Joseph to that task. And he ends up being second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. So Joseph implements his plan. After the 7 good years, the famine comes. Egypt is able to feed her people. Other countries start coming. And because this is a worldwide famine, Jacob and his sons are suffering, and they hear rumors that there's grain in Egypt. And so Jacob sends all of his sons except Benjamin to go get some food. Now, I'm going to spare you the rest of the weird details of how this happens, because it's a very strange tale. And frankly, I kind of can't make heads or tails of what was going on there. But in the end, Joseph is able to save his family and the rest of the world from hunger. And the dreams from the beginning of this story start to make sense. But this is after 13 years. His whole family comes to Egypt. They're all cared for. And after Jacob dies, the brothers start to become afraid. Like, oh no, our dad's dead now. I wonder if Joseph is gonna get his revenge on us for what we did to him. So they come to Joseph and kind of beg him, please don't do anything to us. And Joseph speaks kindly to them. And he says, and I quote, do not be afraid. Am I in place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. You probably have all heard this verse. In order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. So this ends up being the origin story that explains how the Israelites all ended up in Egypt, and it sets up the Exodus story, which I think we're going to be covering next week. Now, I asked you to notice sort of the elements of repetition, the gaps, the things you're curious about, and what you think this story has to do with justice. And I'm going to take a stab at some of those things, but my answers aren't going to be exhaustive. And when I'm done, I'll open it up for a time with reflections and questions. So the repetitive elements I want to touch on are, first of all, the dreams. Dreams play a really important role in this story. And they seem to be ways that God kind of wakes people up and gets their attention. And it also seems to be many times connected to promises that God makes. And this repetitive element is designed to get us, I think partially it's designed to get us to pay attention to the ways that God might be speaking to us. The second repetitive element is betrayal and injustice. This story is jam-packed with injustice. It's everywhere you look in this story. And that storyline keeps leading further and further away from the direction you think it's supposed to go if these dreams are true. And we're reading it as a short story, but as I said, Joseph was a prisoner, basically, for 13 years, betrayed over and over again, and had to wrestle with, did God tell me the truth? Now, promises that aren't realized until they seem impossible are really important story elements that are found all through the biblical narrative. You find it over and over and over again. And this is designed to insulate us against hopelessness, so that when things start to look hopeless and we've been betrayed, people have disappointed us, things are not going the way we think they're supposed to, everything looks terrible, we have these stories that remind us that God is faithful, and they're designed specifically to give us hope. And then the gaps and surprises. There's tons of them in this story, and there's parts of the story that I actually skipped over because this covers like 13 chapters at the end of Genesis. But the one thing I want to point out that was most surprising to me when I read this story is that there is a complete absence of retaliation or revenge or even punishment in this story. There is no mention in the Joseph story about Joseph sort of striking back at any of the people who betrayed him and failed him once he got into a position where he could have done that. He could have retaliated, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't circle back to Potiphar's wife or the official that forgot him in prison. And he never even expresses anger at his brothers for the way they betrayed him. You're reading the story and you keep expecting the other shoe to drop, and it never does. So now what can we take away about justice in this story? I feel really hesitant talking about this because, again, I want to restate, you're not going to get a full picture of what justice looks like in this story. But there are aspects of it that I think are important for us to notice. This is a story that really emphasizes that people have free will. They can genuinely harm one another. They can genuinely do things that are unjust. Things can get really bad because of that. God is not meticulously controlling everyone's choices to make sure that everything goes well, but he also is creative and good, and he's infinitely faithful and able to turn these events that are evil and unjust and bring about his good intentions for his creation. That's the first thing I want to say about it. The second thing is, which I already touched on, is that this that revenge and retaliation and punishment are not at the heart of true justice. Joseph's story starts sort of with this promise and this dream, and it seems like he just was faithful and just kept doing what he could do along the way and was never sidetracked with anger or vengeance or any of those things, which isn't to say that anger is never called for. It really is. But in this story, we have an example of somebody who totally refused to go there because those things don't bring shalom. It's not that punishment is never required, but that's not shalom. So we have to keep those things in mind. And the last thing that I'll leave you with is that justice, moving towards justice, moving towards shalom, is a long road. The Bible basically tells the same story in different form over and over and over and over again to get it through to us. And the story basically is God makes a promise to us and asks us to trust him and asks us to be faithful. We mess it up big time. Things get very bad. Looks like there's no way out. God comes through and is faithful despite this. This is the story that's told over and over and over again in the Bible. And the story is meant to comfort and encourage us when things look impossible, when things look hopeless. So when I look at the state of the world and this avalanche of injustice, and I notice my own hopelessness, I have to keep reminding myself that this is nothing new. It feels new to me. God is inviting us to partner with him to bless the world. He's always been doing this. He's always been asking us to work to bring shalom to our neighbors. And when things get overwhelming, I feel comforted to know that God has good intentions for the world and that he's trustworthy and he's able to take what is broken and evil and to bring about his creative goodness. It's our job to listen to the dreams he's given us and to remain faithful and to trust him. And then it's his job to redeem his creation and turn injustice and evil on its head. So now I will open up for comments and questions, and I'll give you a heads up that I'm probably not going to be able to answer most of them. Go ahead, Terry.
I agree with you, Joseph. He didn't try to punish him, but he did teach him a lesson.
That's the part I skipped.
He did teach him a lesson.
Yes, he did.
Which was that in chapter 44 of Genesis, it says that he commanded the steward of his house, saying, "Fill up the men's sacks with food, all that they can carry, and put every man's money in these sacks mouth, money that they had paid before him." Then he also had them put a cup which belonged
to him.
To Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And so
he scared the crap out of him.
Yeah. He scared not once.
Twice.
Several times. Couple times.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in the end, though, he let them know who he was. At first, they didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
Wow. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know it was Joseph. So he decided, I'm going to have a little fun here now.
Yeah.
Fun for what they did.
It didn't seem like it was very fun for him. He had to hold himself back from weeping several times in that story.
He put a serious spirit to them, especially when he told them to bring their youngest son. I think the first time they wouldn't do it. They didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
Because they feared that the father, if something happened to the youngest son, the father would die. And,
yeah.
Did teach him.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
It makes me think of just restorative justice and thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. when he talks about the goal of justice being the restoration of the relationship and the restoration of the person, not retribution,
right.
but the restoration. that, that you were sharing today just made me think of,
Yeah.
ultimately, that's the goal, right? Not that they get there. So I'm sure it was fun to toy with them. Maybe for a little while, it was mixed emotions for him, but in the end, it was that restoration. I'm sure even for them to have to face the fact that they didn't believe him, but now they're faced with the fact that, oh, it happened.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting story. I love it, but it's restorative justice thing. It's something I think is.
Yeah, through this series, I mean, I said justice is a hard topic for me. I'm sure that Adam and Chris would both agree that that's true. And so I don't think any of us want to come and pretend like we are like sharing our wisdom with you. This is a topic that all of us are going to need to wrestle with together. And just kind of listen for what God's telling us. So yeah.